Arratsaldeon eta ongi etorri guztioi.
Good afternoon and welcome. Gutun Zuria, our festival is coming to the end. We have creators here, Danele Sarriugarte, Beatriz Chivite, Dicharry, and Beñat Sarasola. Dicharry works in the area of research and creation. Beatriz Chivite is an expert on cultural themes in Eastern countries. Danele Sarriugarte works on the subject of voids, for example, and in the latest novel, attention is focused on the world of art. And of course, Beñat Sarasola is the other panelist. He's a writer, a publisher, and today he's going to chair this session. And it's a good time to see how some Basque artists approach contemporary art. And remember that at 7 o'clock they will be signing their books, as you know, in the usual literary corner. So I'd like to welcome them and hand the floor over to you.
Bueno, eskerrik asko, udanek esan bezala.
Well, thank you. I've given the job of moderating this session, and we've distributed this dialogue into 3 sections. The subject is always going to be that of the relationship between literature and contemporary art, and the first section is going to refer to images, both in literature and in contemporary art. In the second section, we're going to be talking about words, and in the third section, we'll be talking about power. And if other subjects come up, we'll also elaborate on them. But I'd like to start with a question so that our panelists can give us a brief answer on this relationship between literature and contemporary art. It's often said that contemporary art has tended to open up the more classic artistic disciplines, and that art has opened up more and more. Now we talk about visual arts, scenic arts, etc. And the first question I'd like to ask is, within this expansion, how do you see literature? Do you see it inside, outside, or how do you see the context of contemporary art? Well, without a doubt, I see it inside contemporary art, because not so much in the West, but in the East. Art and literature have always gone hand in hand. And in my personal case, I sometimes don't write that much. I do collage, drawing, and that's expression, that's art, and I see them hand in hand. And more, we see a mix of mass media in books, in art, anywhere. Eric? Yes, literature, the polymorphic relationship it has with contemporary art can be understood as a return trip. How does literature get into contemporary art, if that's the question? I would add another question. How does contemporary art get into literature? And therefore, to answer your first question, I looked up the terminology, the definitions, and there are a number of terms. The first term is shown literature, and the second is contextual literature, and the third is literature outside the book. And I think that the book is not the only goal. And more we go from the text to the paratext, or from an opus operatum to a modus operandi. They're big words, if you like, but I collected this in writing, and I thought, if I start to read this paper, this session isn't going to go well. So I said, well, I'll just leave them in front of me, and I'll make a sculpture with all the paper I have in my hands. I'll make a sculpture. I'll turn those sheets of paper into balls. And those balls will be made up of the letters here at this center, and they will become a sculpture. And that way we can get into what you were suggesting, how we can go from a text to a sculpture, for example. As I see it, contemporary art is more in literature than the other way around. I believe that in literature there are a number of bridges, a number of authors that will work more on experimentation, but I also see a very solid structure that is inflexible, with a long tradition behind it, and perhaps its relationship with contemporary art. Some ideas and some references are included, and that's why you can see contemporary art, but not so much in the form, but in the object. And I see that this is a stream. Novels are novels. This is this, that is that. I think that that's still very much alive. I mentioned literature, and I was referring to literature in the traditional sense, what Eric was saying. This isn't a literary festival, it's a festival of letters. And I think that's significant, because it's a literary expression that goes beyond words.
Tradizionalean artean edo ze kokapen izango lukeen, ez? Bueno.
So whether we take literature in its traditional form or not, how would that be a position in art? But getting on to the subject, I would like to talk about images in visual arts in particular. It has been a significant resource through history, but there are also many writers in recent times that include images, archives. They've been mentioned here. But Eric also has examples of this. So what do you think of this relationship between images and text? Well, I'm going to go back to China again. The Tang dynasty. 1,000 years ago, it was a dynasty, and artists already combined images and text. And for me, this is the power of the Chinese language. In a character, in a pictogram, they have the image, the meaning, the sound, the form. Everything forms part of that character or pictogram. Picasso used to say that if he'd been born in China, he wouldn't have been a painter. He would have been a calligraphist, because calligraphy, abstract art, poetry, everything is included in a single character. But in the Ming dynasty, however, 500 years later, literature artists weren't artists or writers, because they worked together with images and poetry, and started to write poetry in Peking. And this is my intellectual background. And I work on images in the form of collage or Indian ink. And at the same time, I write poetry. And they usually go hand in hand. They mean the same thing. And one helps the other. This reminds me in the frameworks we often hold these discussions in this Western framework, where things are very distributed in the tradition, but it's not the same everywhere. Yes, if we think about words, in all cultures, including the Basque culture, words are linked to sound. So why do we make a differentiation between sound and image? It's all a single sensation, a form of expressing oneself. In recent months, I've done a lot of thinking because I took a course, and Elena Espiazu, an illustrator, told me that when she worked with writers, she says they usually send in a written text where they explain everything, and when images and words are brought together, they each play a function. In other words, we're always told not to be redundant, that images shouldn't say what words say, and words shouldn't say what the image says. And Joseba Larrache is the comedian that also talks about the relationship with script writers. And in the little work I've done with them, I especially identify as a writer, and I can do a sketch at home. But what is considered to be art, I've always done through writing. But the script writers, people that work in the theatre, understand this more clearly. In other words, those creative mechanisms aren't always displayed through words. When you work from somebody with a different discipline, your creative process is at that initial stage. We're going to tell this story, we'll do this or that. And then the words you write will be the words that are needed to develop the story. But everything behind that is hidden. And that's why I think that those of us that have only written narrative always want to make use of the whole text. And sometimes part of your creation is going to be left behind in the shadows. And there are disciplines that bring together images and text, such as illustrated books, comics, etc. For example, many people that produce comics write or draw. But in illustrated books, the tradition is for somebody to write and somebody else to do the drawing. But I think that in Basque literature, this has expanded. We worked with Joseba, we worked on a comic, 6 of us, and I feel that it's something done by both. It's not that I sent in the text and he did the illustration. The project wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't worked together. Eric, in one of your works, there are the poems and then the images. But I think it's quite significant that in that work, the images do not represent the text. In other words, the images in themselves fulfill a function. Would you like to talk about that book? Asgard Bansi. I wrote this book in New York, as I explained once. I plan to go to New York and write a narrative there. I was in New York. I wrote my story, and then I thought, that I wasn't at all happy with what I'd written. And I thought, I'm going to change the format. And from the story I'd written, well, I left it aside. and I looked for its footprints. And the Astadbanki are the footprints of the story I'd written. And that's how I did it, thinking that in this world, stories have become the king. And we always write under the shadows of story writing. And in the Anglo-Saxon world, there's a single dichotomy for the writer. You're either in favor of fiction, you write in that world, or you write non-fiction. But there's also something outside story writing, isn't there? But to tie this in with the idea you were talking about, text and images, Gansier wrote philosophy in French. Image, phrase. In other words, there's a great paradox in the concept, and I think that today we have joined a new world where visibility is king, and parataxis, on the other hand, the non-purity and the plurality are what prevail. And yet there are many puns in the images. And this is closely related to artistic montages, etc. In the exhibitions, we see that the arrangement of the work and the multiple meaning brings us to the phrase and the image. In your work, for example, you mentioned montage, which is one of the resources of the cinema, and it's also included in contemporary art. But I think that in your texts, you often use the montage. In other words, some texts you've written, you take them, you cut them out, and you cross them over with others. Is that how you work? Yes. My writing is conceptual. I have an idea. And to end with this, because I think it's interesting, therefore, well, I'll finish with this, and I'll make a ball later. Each area is the home of the other. In other words, in words and not a matter of what can be said, and images aren't a matter of what can be seen. Words and images both share functions. And you, Bea, for example, you were saying earlier that you don't see that separation so clearly between words and images. That you consider them to be different languages, but you don't think, now I'm writing, now I'm drawing. How does your process work? For me, images are a different language. And for me, language is very important. I've learned Chinese. I try not to forget my Basque, although I've been away for 12 years. So words are very important. But for me, they're all images. Metro, the second book I wrote, they're portraits of people. I couldn't pull out my camera and take pictures of people. But at the Biennale, when I did my stay in Venice, The relationship I had with images, I manifested through words, so they speak to each other. Images, words are different languages. And when it comes to showing that to the public in a book, for example, through a publisher, have you seen any limits when it comes to deciding how to publish it? One thing is the creation process, but then there are certain limits when it comes to publishing it. Yes, publishing images, it's much more expensive, and I would very much like photographs of the characters to appear in the book Metro or in the Biennale book. I would also like to show the photographs of the sculptures, but it's not so easy because it's so expensive. But in the film published by Daniela, there are also drawings done by me on what Pekin is like. What I'm trying to say by this is that our formats the publishing institutions still use the classic formats, and these are limitations for the writers if they want to go beyond. But we have the social media and Instagram. If they go to my Instagram, they're not going to find words. So they're mostly images and collage. And collage also includes poetry. Poetry is the moment of change. When somebody voids one of oneself, I show that change through images. And now, in my opinion, the social media facilitate the possibility of expressing other things, something that we can't do with museums or publishers. We'll talk about this later. If you agree, we can move on to the next section. And we said that words in the extensive sense, and before we were talking about theory and how in contemporary art, beyond the object, there are also words, theories that are usually very important, and also the other way around, I would say. In contemporary literature, there is also a trend to include theory, words. What do you think of this, Danele? I would first like to say, to answer the first question, the relationship between literature and art. What do we understand a book to be? We have a struggle there. And in the Pekin book, I know that there are a number of images there. And Pamiela has put its stakes on special books, including Eric's book, or Asier Rozas, or Juan Antonio Arce. And there is a lack of flexibility in the object itself, as I said. And so how can we combine words with sound, images, and how to turn that into matter? There we have some unfinished business. Yes, I forgot. Discourse in literature, yes. A friend of ours recently published a book where there are a few digressions and little discourse, but I had to do an interview with Mirena Muriza, who published the novel Bassa, and I said, generate a discourse for the interview on the book. And we read more and more about theory. Theory is present, and theory can be about psychology, about politics, and in the end this filters through. We read more theory, and that's why it's easier to use the first person, because you use the first person. And I'm not saying I'm against it. I don't see it as good or bad. I think that there's a fairly clear trend But we've started to go into the theory, the thinking, and in those limits between thinking and literature, between fiction and fiction, not everything is so separate. We have this super classifying vision, and that limits what we want to say. And regarding theory, Arthur Danton, a very well-known philosopher, said that art ends up in philosophy, or that art ends up being philosophy in a way. Eric, how do you see this? Words, theory? I thought of covering the history of art with a book. Therefore, if you take a book, put it on a table, and you start to paint this book, you will become mimetic, like Picasso did. If you take a book, like he took a painting, and you make a book of the book, if you paint that book with nothing inside, and if you take a book, you tear out a page and you stick it to the painting, that leads you to the field of cubist creations. So you go from that mimetic exercise to that cubist exercise, and then you take this book, for example. I've taken mine. Well, you take this book and you turn it upside down, and you put it in a painting. And that way you're aligning yourself with Duchamp's view. What's the work of Duchamp? An object. It's a matter of taking an object and transforming it. He says this chair is art. I turn it upside down. And the fact that it's signed by Duchamp is what justifies turning the chair around 180 degrees. Because you can see his signature on it. And Duchamp's urinary, for example. The urinary, the same thing. He took it, and he didn't just put it there, he turned it upside down. And there we can also see Duchamp's signature. So, as I said, somebody can come along and take Duchamp's urinary and slaughter it. They can break it, and with those pieces of a slaughtered urinary, they can create a sort of package in which to include the content of the decade of the 70s. And that takes us to what is currently being done in art.
Today, it is not only about transfiguration. I think we've reached a point, since you mentioned Danton as well, and he said that the historical evolution of art resides in the evolution of philosophy. This is the idea of Dante's. This is what he had in mind. So I think that the historical evolution of art does not have to do with that philosophy of art, but with that dismaterialization of art, that vanishing of art. And from there comes the importance of all the explanation of the words And this is why in contemporary art exhibitions, you've realized maybe, and you've had that experience, that only with a piece of work, it was not enough. It was necessary a concept or a theory. And also you were saying that lately you see more and more in those contemporary art exhibitions, words are more and more present. Yes, she says, and words by themselves, not only the ones giving meaning to art, also poetry. If you go to the Guggenheim, you've got now Jenny Holzer, and Jenny Holzer is about LEDs, lights, LED lights, and some lines, some phrases, and that is some sentences. That is art. So this is why there are also drawings. It's a multisensorial exhibition, what we show nowadays. So to me, more and more, a museum is a place where we include different types of art. And this is due to different reasons and has got different meanings. On the one hand, this comes from the idea of conveying some ideas to people by some different means or media. And then in a magazine on art, they said that museums are now including poetry because it doesn't sell well, because it's not really in the market. We know that plastic arts are part of the market in capitalism, and poetry is out of that market. So when we introduce poetry in an exhibition, we're sort of giving some value to it. I think more and more poetry is more and more capitalized, is more and more part of the market, especially some kind of poetry. My sister is here, and I think she doesn't like too much that kind of poetry, the poetry that is sold on Instagram. But for one reason or other, museums now have made the decision to sort of value poetry more, maybe to attract more visitors, and they are using music, videos, and poetry. You mentioned, he says, Rupi Kaur. He's one of those poets that uses Instagrams to sell his work. They're not really poets, they're also performers, and I think they're very successful. She says, I don't like them a lot. I don't like Rupi Kaur a lot, but I don't think we can really criticize a lot of these artists. I think, first of all, he sold his own story, personal story. And I think this Rupi Kaur, she makes very personal poetry, and she works with also performing elements, but these performances only happened later. She was called from many places when they realized she was so successful. And she's got millions of followers on Instagram. And she is a poet that is selling very well in the latest years and has been translated to many languages, more than Shakespeare. Yes, in relation to the word, he says, I think it is also interesting, it's another subject. That is bringing the words into the Basque language. This is how language will condition contemporary art and literature. Danele, maybe you can say something about that. Well, Danele says that maybe in our context, literature is very important because our language is supposed to be under risk. And maybe I learned at a school the Basque language, so I didn't really realize about that risk, but I did perceive some limitations about the sociological sort of approach for this work. But the debate has always been that the literature has always been more powerful because the literature and the Basque language sort of make us be Basque. But precisely very abstract arts, like visual arts, have been very powerful also to sort of shape the Basque identity. We've got pieces that are very abstract and are very good symbols. Yes, Beñat Sarasola was mentioning this precisely yesterday. That's what he mentions in his work, the symbolic power of Oteiza and Chillida to Basque sculptures. Yeah, she says, on the one hand, you see what is real, and then on the other hand, you see that superiority of literature. And I think this can be somehow an obstacle to really lay bridges to other arts and to set a real communication with other arts. And you mentioned that as well, Bea, how the language also has an impact on how you create. So the fact that you're speaking and using one language in your creation, depending on the importance of that language, is more or less important. It is as your body. It might be lighter or heavier. This has an impact on your creation as well. And I think it is very important to mention this because we've seen generations that were very popular abroad and were not very well known here. After Oteiza and Chillida, Xavier made very interesting reflections about that. Eric, about this, you write in French and Basque, and you create in both languages. So how do you see this issue of language in contemporary Basque art? Well, he says, I was kind of shocked. We usually say languages are co-official, that you have to have a certain degree in Basque to work in a public institution. But what is the reality? What happens really? One goes to a very well-known institution of contemporary art. You talk to the director, and do you ask him, do you speak Basque? And he doesn't, he can't speak Basque. And that's quite shocking. What a contradiction. There is a contradiction in what reality is telling us and what politicians tell us. I was shocked.
Zigor eskulturarekin egon nintzen behin, eta euskara kontu hori aipatu genuen, eta zigorek esan zidan, bai euskara.
I was talking about this issue of Basque with Zigor, and Zigor, he told me, yes, an artist and a sculptor has its own language, but then needs the Basque language to compose his thinking, to think, and to convey to his sculptures whatever he had in his mind. So that Basque language will become evident in his work. To me, that is important, the space of the Basque language in creation, also in our daily life, in that way of creating. What is the place of that language? Well, Beñat said that is very Oteiza-like. It's Oteiza. He also said that by means of the language, the Basque identity would show. Well, the languages we speak are our limits because they sort of shape our brains. So if we speak in Basque, we have a certain vision of the cosmos. And if we speak Chinese, that will make us think differently. Not only, it doesn't mean only we know a language, we also think in a different way. So languages are sort of shaping the way in which we talk, we are, we create, and we think. I fully agree, says Eric. I was in Toronto talking to somebody, and there we met somebody coming from Madrid. Then I started talking in Spanish, and then somebody that was with me said, like, Eric, I don't recognize you when you change your language. It is not that, it's no longer you. It has an impact on how you are. When you speak Spanish or Basque or French, you are not the same person as when you speak in English or Chinese. Unfortunately, I don't speak Chinese, but I've spent a lot of time in Greece, and I can handle some Greek, and then I am also a different person when I am in Greece. So this shows the impact of a language in how you express yourself, how you are, and on what you create. To me, Basque means you've got to act in a very simple way. When I am speaking Basque, I am more like simple. Yes, maybe you are closer to land, to the earth, says Beñat. Okay, let's move on to the last part. You've mentioned institutions, Eric, museums, publishing houses. Well, all institutions have an impact on contemporary art and literature. Eric said there was something a bit parallel in between what the institutions and the publishing houses do. Could we further elaborate on this? Yes, well, they sort of screen things. I mean, who has not received from a publishing house a letter saying, I am afraid I'm not going to publish what you've sent us? Well, they've got to sort of filter things, to screen things. In a publishing house, and I look at you because you also publish with Pamela, they talked about a collection, because when you work with a publishing house, you realize whether it is very important or not. And Mr. Fonseca said yesterday that it was important to him that in Hispanic language, or in the Hispanic world, there are like collections of books, and in the Anglo-Saxon world, it seems like books are more like independent. Yes, in the Hispanic world, you sort of end up in a list, and you are somehow enrolled and become part of that list, and then you can also see who else wrote for Pamela, and you start being part of that story, of the story of this publishing house. And the fact that you are published by a certain publishing house then sort of adds some legitimacy to you. So when I was invited, I wondered, who are they inviting? The anthropologist, the poet, or the artist? When I was invited to come to this festival, I see myself as an artist, and an artist does not produce factos. My art is in my book, if you want to put it that way. So if you want to discover my art, you can read my text. because I usually say that my artworks are pieces of art that do not exist at all times. And I think literature shows the evolution of history of art, and I think that e-praxis is the end of that. I was in Arles talking to Andrés Sedano, a very well-known photographer. He had an exhibition in the Lambert Foundation on torture, and I wanted to find out how he would deal with that subject. So I went there and I was talking to him. He said the last step of art will be a crime, a murder. A murder? I asked. Okay. Then I thought of a film by Lars von Trier. There in a film, we see that precisely in that film. He tells the story of a schizophrenic person, how this crazy person kills people, and then these dead bodies become part of his sculpture. So that prophecy by Andrés was that translated on that film by Lars von Trier. Danele says that Cusco Tandem has been also published in Pamela. In the cover of your last novel, the main character is an artist. So you worked a bit on the relationship of that artist and the grants, and in literature this is also the case. What did you want to find out? Well, she says, as a user, I knew literature, but I didn't want to write on literature because that was too close to me. And then I live in San Sebastian, and I live in a Guia neighborhood. And it was at the time the cultural capital in 2016. Many things were going on in the city. And at the time, I was writing a book. And I wanted, on the one hand, do some research, because, as you said, we have to send explanations. Sometimes I've been a jury in one to give grants, and sometimes we see that they don't express what they wanted to express, really, and that's quite concerning. And also, we've got what Rupika says. As a writer myself, I had an image of what I thought or what I am. I am nothing very interesting. And you've made a big effort writing a book, but then I think we give lots of oxygen to the other. And I think visual arts and music has also this capacity to fight against that, because there is the object, and then it is true you need some knowledge for that object, but it's much more immediate. Well, to know the writer, you have to read the book. There you have an object. There you have a book, and with that you can produce a piece. And there is even an exhibition at the Cursal by Carmen Calvo in San Sebastian. And there are some books that are opened with a Barbie doll. And when I walked in there, that object was appealing to me. And that could be a book, that could be in a bookshop. So a book has that materiality that we don't have. Well, I think in relation to this, as Beñat, we have also the exhibition and the festival. And there are many examples of this type in the room that we have next door. You're also talking about the public image of artists and literature and the relationship in between the public sphere and the institutions. That is something important. Yeah, she says, because you have to sell yourself. I was quite lucky because I won, because in the Basque Country, in the field of literature, they're very good, they give you many grants, but then when I go to London, I talk to my friends, it is so difficult to get a grant or a scholarship. I've got a book that I have a very good friend that has written many books, but he cannot get published, and he's sold as something exotic. He says, I am a hippie, homosexual, English, so he's trying to sell himself. And you've got to present yourself as something exotic. Otherwise, you don't reach the market. There's no niche for you in the market. And this happens very often in Instagram, where you can really show yourself, you can show your life, your personal issues, and it is very difficult to get into somebody else's life. But if you get to know the life of somebody else, maybe you would have an interest on his or her literature, and that sells as well. And then at the end of the day, nobody likes money, but we all need money. And we have to try to sell ourselves, and that means that you have to get a grant, a scholarship, be on the social media, or what you write is a part of your literature, but then it depends on how you show yourself. We've got 5 minutes to go. We're going to give the floor over to the audience. Raise your hand, please, if you want to make a comment or a question. Now we have a wireless microphone for you. Don't be afraid. What does it mean to be a writer? What do we ask a writer? To talk in front of an audience? Usually writers, we write in solitude. And then sometimes you participate in roundtables, so you become visible, and you have to control also your orality. So then I thought, what would a writer do if he was dumb? How would he or she give a lecture? I am going to conclude with a poetical performance, if there are no further questions. So we will have a book signature, and he's going to be drawing as well. Okay, so we got 5 minutes. Don't run away. Even it is correct at time. Do not run away. So I will do a performance.
Pasatu ditut ordu luzeak eta ehun milaka gaur. Hautsi direla ene usteak bideak aragitzen nao. Kaken begisotil mutuek ilargi baten dirdira, josi didate hatz da mutuek egin dute tira bira. Hori. Eta hor duzue eskultura, beraz, hor duzue eskultura. Eta hau ez da artea, badakizu zer gaitik...
Well, this is not art. Do you know why? Because it is not institutionalized.